The T hack is an absolute nightmare. If you haven't been keeping up, it's one of the biggest stories right now. T is an app for women to share information about men that they've dated. I don't want to go into the details of how we feel about this. I'm sure that we all have opinions. What we're here to talk about is the absurd hack that occurred to them. And yes, I am calling it a hack. I know people are going to argue against it. They're wrong. We'll go in detail on what's going on here. I really didn't want to cover this, though. There are lots of other YouTubers that do security stuff really well, but the more I've looked into it, the more I realize this isn't a traditional security issue or exploit. This is bad design decisions that have caused for absurd amounts of data to leak through what I would indeed consider a hack. Another hot take I have on this is that it's not because of vibe coding at all. I know a lot of people seem to think it is that, but it's not. I have a bunch of sources to prove it, including but not limited to the founder's history as a boot camp grad that learned all of his stuff then and hasn't seemed to learn much since, as well as the tech behind the scenes that has enabled all of this. Spoiler, Firebase. There's a lot of fun to dig into here. I've not been pumped about how I've seen others covering it, so we're going to do our best to go into the details and make this a reasonable breakdown of why security issues like this happen. All of that said, it's been a huge time sink, and we need to pay our bills, so quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive right in. It's easier than ever to go from inspiration to good-looking application. These AI tools are really good at it. If you hand them the right starting point, they will take them really far. But finding that right starting point has never been harder. When you Google image search for reference UI for, I don't know, a sign-in page or a paywall, the things you'll find are garbage. I've spent way too much time trying to find good inspiration on Google Images, and it's just not it. So if you're trying to make a good design or just make a good app without spending a bunch of time in Figma, today's sponsor is going to help you out a ton. Mobbin has already changed how I think about design on like a fundamental level. They have over 400,000 screens across 1,000 different iOS, Android, and web apps that you can use for reference. It's actually hilarious how easy it is to find things that are useful reference points when you're designing. Let's say you want to add, I don't know, a forgot password screen to your app. Here is how it looks in a ton of different things. We got Sense here, we got Universe, Kraken, and let's say you're concerned because your industry category is different. The photo and video world does things different than other places. Now we're filtering down to photo and video apps that have a reset password view somewhere. We can switch this to be, I don't know, let's find paywalls on news apps. Subscription and paywall, news, and here we go. This is what the different paywalls look like in a bunch of different news apps. Super useful point for reference. And if you want to check web, just click the toggle. Here's a bunch of websites that have paywalls that you can use as a reference point as you make your own designs. And it's also never been cheaper. It's literally $10 a month. That is insanely cheap for how useful a resource this is, and I'll gladly pay for it for my whole team just so they spend less time hunting Google Images for stuff that ends up being useless in the end. It's such a good deal. I highly recommend you check them out. Try it today at soydev.link/mobbin. Let's break down the T hack. There are a couple core things I want to go into. What happened? So like, what was the hack? And more importantly, what leaked? How did it happen? And of course, why/how can it be prevented? We're going to do our best to answer all of these questions. So first, what happened? Since the T app is only for women, meaning only women can sign up, they've put a lot of work into making sure that people are verified as they sign up. The verification process is sometimes somebody scanning their face, sometimes it's somebody submitting an ID. All of it is generating files that have to be stored somewhere. Those files were stored on Firebase in a public bucket, and the data in that bucket leaked, which means that there are now hundreds of thousands of photos of people's faces, IDs, and more of people who submitted to join this app that are now publicly accessible because somebody found all the URLs, saved all the files, and now is posting them and sharing them around the world. So what happened is T's files, specifically their file bucket, was accessed, not directly, not like they had configuration access to the bucket, but all the files in the file bucket were accessed. It's also worth noting this bucket hasn't been used since 2024, so all new user signups were not affected, but older users that have been there since the early days, their data almost certainly was leaked in this. For the first leak, the data was files, primarily images uploaded by users to verify their identity. And that's sketchy stuff to leak. And also, they did not process these files properly, so a lot of them still have metadata attached. Because when you take a photo with an iPhone, it keeps track of all of that information, and if you upload the photo without stripping that data, it's now part of it forever. Yeah, not great. They also just had another hack where all of the message data that was in the app was exposed as well, and they shut down the messaging feature entirely due to this one. I think we have the overview here of what happened and a good bit of why this is bad. No one would want this data exposed. Whether or not you love or hate these users or this app, I know I have my own feelings about it too. This is never good. This isn't fair. People did not expect this when they signed up, and it sucks that this data has been exposed. We're going to make it a lot harder for the company as we break down how hard they fucked up in order to let this happen. So how did this happen? The big question we are all here for. Let's start with some of the most common misconceptions. The bucket was public. Nothing was hacked. I've seen this comment so many times, and there are two big reasons why it's stupid. The first reason why it's stupid is because we use the term hack similar to how we use the term steal. If somebody left their front door unlocked and someone else came in, went through their drawers and stole a bunch of things and left, they still stole from that person, even if the door was unlocked. Maybe they didn't break in, but they absolutely stole. Hack is used as an all-in-one term, both for the process of breaking in and for the process of accessing and redistributing that information. As such, the term hack is perfectly fine here, even if they didn't have to work around anything to get that data. So I fundamentally disagree with everybody who says we shouldn't use the term hack here. We can describe how bad their security was, but still call it a hack, because it was still a hack. It's also worth noting that a lot of services expose URLs publicly. If you have a URL to something, you can probably access it most of the time. This includes, but isn't limited to, really big services. Like up until somewhat recently, Google Photos had public URLs for all of the things uploaded. But those URLs are randomly generated and impossible to guess. So you can't just find all of the files. If somebody sends it, or they're using a sketchy VPN that tracks where the URL is, you can grab it from that. But if you already have compromised at that level, you have access to the data anyways. So all of the theoretical ways somebody can access the data because it's on a publicly exposed URL, kind of silly, because in order to get that in the first place, you can also probably have grabbed the file too. Very silly. So yeah. So again, point one, hack is often used to describe the stealing of information, which happened here. Even if it's easy to access, it was still done. But the more important piece here is that they got all of the URLs. Getting the URLs is indeed hacking, because they needed to find an endpoint that would expose that information in a way that they could hit it to get said information in order to get the URLs for all those files. You can't just magically sniff every public URL on a website. That's not how the world works. There are hundreds of billions of these UUID tagged file uploads. You can't just magically snap your fingers just because they're public and have them. You need an index. And getting that index is indeed hacking. Like if I broke into somebody's car and in the car there was a key to get into their house, and then I used it to get into their house, sure, I didn't break into the house, but I broke into the fucking car. It's just silly to say this isn't a hack. It's really silly. I don't want to zoom in on this because PII and whatnot, but the thing I want to emphasize here is that in order for the hackers that came from various sites that did this to get the data, they had to access it through the JSON, which thankfully someone way back machined, because they were on Firebase and the Google API to do ttheapp.appspot. That's just the way that a lot of stuff works on Firebase. They were able to get all of the items from the bucket this way. So they were able to hit this endpoint and find all of the files and their URLs by hitting an endpoint that was exposed that listed all of the data. That's the difference here. Exposing file URLs is not that big a deal. Should you have them private? Probably. Should you use a competent service for managing your files? Almost certainly. I highly recommend Uploadthing. There's a reason we built it. It's a really good service. That all said, having public URLs is not enough to cause hacks like this. You need access to the list of URLs, which they also did because they're incompetent. I don't have any details on the chat hack, but I'm assuming it's something very similar where they had a Firebase API that was exposed. So I guess it's time to break down that part. Why did this happen and how can it be prevented? If all goes well, this will be the vast majority of this video. This is where we have things to actually learn. Was it vibe coding? Good question. I can't say for sure either way whether or not they were using AI when they built this, but considering most of the data came from a bucket that stopped being used in mid-2024, it's very unlikely they actually vibe coded this. So for many reasons, I don't think this is vibe coding. I'm going to justify that in an interesting way. Eva, Bra, and Logi have been part of the community for a while now. They've been doing a lot of hacking, primarily of Firebase sites, because Firebase allows for easy misconfigurations. They've pwned over 900 sites and 125 million accounts using one vulnerability that's kind of just the default on how Firebase works. At this point, I'm pretty confident in saying Firebase is a problem, not even here, just in general, but I want to break down a bit of why. It's rare I get handed such a great opportunity to shit on one of my least favorite things in the entire development ecosystem, and I've been handed one from the gods. I'm going to run with this opportunity as far as I run shitting on Flutter, because Firebase is really, really bad. So let's break down why I think this. If we have a spectrum of developers here, and on one side we have like systems infra guys, Like the people who are nerdy about kernels, who want to spin up their own servers themselves that will manage your infrastructure for you, those types of people. And on the other hand, we have front-end devs centering divs, where on one side we have the deep in the weeds people, and on the other side we have the nerdy front-end devs, the people who get stereotyped as me. You know who you are. You know who we are. Where would mobile devs fit? Where do you guys think mobile devs go, chat? If you've been hanging around me for a while, you probably already know the answer to this one. Mobile devs go more towards the infrastructure side, more towards the front-end side, or somewhere else? Look at that. You guys have been hanging around for a while. Mobile devs don't go closer to infra. They don't even go closer to front-end. They go far, far past. I'll have to zoom out to make my point. The gap between a front-end dev and a server guy is roughly the same as the gap between a front-end dev and a mobile dev. This was a hard thing for me to accept because when I was doing mobile, I was really nerdy about systems and Linux and things like that. But mobile dev was really fun and let me take those native things that I cared about and put them in front of people for them to use, which was really cool. I think about this a lot because when you tell front-end devs about new server tech, they tend to say really stupid things. Like when you bring up server components in the React world, everyone's favorite, trying to explain to a front-end dev why this is useful is like pulling teeth. They just can't get it. They don't have the right mental model to understand it because it's so far from the world in which they work, which is the thing in the browser, not the way it gets there. So when server components happened, I assumed that mobile devs would be better for understanding them because I thought mobile devs were somewhere between the two here. I was wrong. Mobile devs are all the way out there. And this is where our friend Firebase comes in. If you're not already familiar, Firebase is the way to make your app blank the best it can be. That's funny. Does that work in other browsers? I can also see that the gray for the background there is, God, Firebase is so jank. It's so jank. I can't. I was trying to show their site to give a good impression, but it's impossible. Jesus fuck. Firebase was the first major attempt at a backend as a service provider. The goal was to handle everything from the database to the file storage to auth to the APIs in order to make it easy to build apps, web apps and mobile apps, but definitely focused more on mobile. Firebase got bought by Google, and it has since been around. Firebase. The problem with Firebase is the way that it thinks about data. In most systems, you have a database, which obviously is a rhombus. And of course, you have users, which are obviously circles. And the user obviously doesn't access the database directly. The way users access things is through a layer in between, often called an API. This is a server that you have built and written code for. And when a user wants to do something, the user will hit a named endpoint on this API. Like let's say we have a /getProfile. So the user hits this getProfile endpoint. GetProfile will then send a query to the database that you wrote code for along the lines of select star from profiles where ID equals some ID. So it will run this query that you wrote code for in the API. It will respond with the data for that request. The API will reshape it or do whatever it needs to, and then send it back to the user. This is how most infrastructure design works. But remember, there's part of this diagram that these people don't like. Mobile devs tend to have their brains fall out as soon as you say server or API too loudly. As such, this in the middle is scary to them. And Firebase had a really simple solution to this problem. What if we just delete the API and let the user access the database directly? What if the database is an API? What if the user can just query for the data they need? And then you don't have to make an API. Everything the user could ever need is already exposed. You just ask for it and it will be given to them. Obvious, right? This is a great solution to the problem. You're probably, hopefully, seeing why this is a bad idea. Because there's a lot of things that APIs can and should have that databases by default don't. Like on an API, you can check that the person asking for getProfile is the person. If I hit the API endpoint /getProfile and I hit it with ID some ID, but I also have a cookie and the ID for the cookie is someone else, then the server will verify when I ask for this ID that I am who I am by checking the cookie. And if these two aren't the same, the API can throw me an error and I won't go to the DB. But if I am the person I'm saying I am, then it can choose to go get me the data that I'm asking for. It's relatively easy to write code like this. We've all probably done it at this point in our lives. If not, I highly recommend building an API yourself. It'll make you much more deeply understand how the entire internet works. And once you do this, you can much more freely query the database. You don't have to turn the database into a permission system. The permission system is in the API. When you write the API endpoints, it's pretty obvious you have to do this as you write it. Like, it just stands out to you when you're writing it. Oh, I didn't check the authentication. I didn't check to make sure they can get this data. I'm going to add those checks because you're writing code that turns a user's intent into the data that the user wants. You're not writing a query that accesses an unlimited set of data in order to get the data the user wants. When you write in this way, when you have a secure environment that has access to everything or nothing that you're writing code in, it's much easier to write code that only accesses what you're supposed to access. But if you're not writing code, you're instead writing roles or permissions or row-based access control, you end up with a lot of problems because databases don't have code. You don't write an API endpoint in your database. Instead, what you're writing in your database is data. And if the data needs to have a permissions layer attached, that's a new thing that you're stapling onto the database. And it's not obvious that you need to do that. In fact, there's a very good chance you're doing it wrong when you do it this way. So commonly so that lots of sites are hacked in all of the exact same ways. I have hated these things so much for so long that I built the whole T3 stack around it. I've been shitting on a ton of different technologies that do this for years now, including one of my favorites, the misuses of GraphQL that I often see. A mistake that I see all of the time is people put GraphQL between the database and the server, or worse, the database and the user, and GraphQL is how they'll define the code that is the roles that users do and do not have in order to access certain data. That is a disaster waiting to happen. The harsh reality is that when your users need data, you should be defining a new endpoint for that data. So if I'm working on an app and I'm adding a feature to show the user's profile, I should have to write server-side code to do that unless the API endpoint already exists, which it almost certainly won't if that's a new feature that you're adding. It is essential that when you add a new feature that requires new data, that you're defining a new way to access the data as well as the actual code on the front end that will access that data. Exposed by default is the way that these platforms work, and that is bad. When the default is that everything's exposed, just ask for what you want and later add on rules to prevent access to certain things, you end up in a nightmare and no one bothers to secure anything because there's no reason to. There's no point in the process where it makes sense to. But if you have to define an endpoint, a function, or something in order to be the in-between of the user's request and the database, this gets much easier. Not to plug a sponsor, but this is part of what I like Convex so much for. Convex gives you a database, but the database cannot be accessed directly from the client. The database has to be accessed through queries and mutations that you define as real functions in your codebase. Here's the actual T3 chat codebase. We're in the Convex folder. In here, I have a lot of different things defined, like a message table. It has an ID, a thread ID, user ID, reasoning, which we're not using anymore because we're doing message parts instead now. We have all of this data that is here. So you must be thinking, well, if Convex is a backend as a service similar to Firebase, users can just access this, right? Wrong. There is no way built in for an API or a user to access this data. If I want to expose it, I have to choose to expose it. And I choose to expose this data in the messages file where I have a get by thread ID query, which uses my custom auth query helper that auths the user. I then check the thread ID. If I don't have one, I return empty array. I also grab the user ID and I collect all messages where the thread ID matches what they're asking for, as well as the user ID matching. So if these two things don't match, we get back nothing and they get an empty array. It's that easy. But since I had to define this as actual code instead of just giving access to the database, it's now way more secure because when I write every line, it's obvious what I need to do. And this is the real key point I want to drive home. All data access should be shown in your source code. The fact that I even have to specify this hurts me deeply. I cannot believe we're still in an era where people think that their database can just be the API. It can't be. It's the database. Databases are for storing data. APIs are for accessing the data. These are different things, and there's a reason they both exist. If you want to build in a way that pulls them tighter together, like Convex does, awesome. There's lots of other options for that as well. But if you're trying to replace the API with the database, you're going to run into problems like this, be it on Firebase or Supabase or any of the other alternatives. This is also why I get so frustrated when I'm talking about Convex. People are like, oh, it's not that different from Supabase. They couldn't be more different. They have almost nothing in common. Ugh. Long separate rant for another time. So this is all fun, but where did the hack actually happen? What occurred here? Well, since the users access the Firestore database directly through the Firebase built-in APIs, a lot of those were just exposed. And you could hit the URL for their Firebase storage endpoint, which was for ttheapp.appspot.com, and it would just dump all of the items that are currently in the Firebase file storage because you would access it by hitting this API. In a better architected app, you would think about this a bit differently. Not to self-plug yet again, but we have an attachments table in our database. The files aren't stored in the attachments table. We're still storing them on upload thing because upload thing's awesome. Of course, we're using that. But they're stored there, and we store the URLs for these files here. That's the key difference, is the attachments are stored in the attachments table, and the actual file that is attached is in the URL that is somewhere else. So if you wanted to hack us theoretically and all of our URLs were public, you could bomb us by hitting the attachments endpoint and getting all of those. Wait, there is no attachments endpoint because we're competent at writing software. Also because Convex leads you in the right direction here. Instead of having an endpoint that is /attachments that gives you every attachment for every user, we have a get my attachments function that will get the attachments for your files because they check your user ID through the auth layer. Firebase does not encourage good patterns like this. Firebase lightly encourages you to just expose everything because that's the easiest way to get started. Other platforms require you to write an API in order to access the data. If you don't have to write code to expose data, the service is not leading you towards good security practices. No data access code is security issues just waiting to happen. I will never support a platform that encourages you just expose everything to the user because that is not a good way of building. This is why I've been so anti-Firebase for so long and why I've been so concerned about the lack of willingness to learn about servers. This is why I also push so hard for tech like server components, like Next.js, like all of these things that put you in a mindset where you're thinking about how the backend and frontend interact. You need to think about these things. There are 3 parts to your systems. As I showed here, you have the database, you have the APIs and your servers, and you have your users, the clients, the code that runs on front end, all of that. And if you're not thinking in this way, if you don't have these different pieces, you are compromising. Unless you don't have users. And do you really have users? You get the point. I think I've driven home everything I need to here. Please be careful when you use things like Firebase. And I know, mobile devs, you hate learning about these other things. You have a weird, deeply set fear of JavaScript and an even bigger fear of servers. As an ex-mobile dev from almost a decade ago, I highly, highly encourage you get over it. It will make you much more successful in your career and way more valuable, especially in an era where people are vibe coding absolute slop and don't understand any of this either. The hottest take I'll throw in here is that the average mobile dev is indistinguishable from a full-stack vibe coder when it comes to talking about servers. I know I'm going to be screenshotted and have this shared everywhere. I don't care. This is the type of thing that happens all of the time when you tell mobile devs they have to store their data somewhere. I've encountered this enough times through my career doing consulting and working with mobile devs that my brain feels like it's falling out just having these conversations. This is the reason that Firebase can still get users. There are so many of these stories. Literally, almost all of America's fast food companies were pwned because mobile devs built infrastructure, and the infrastructure was built with Firebase because it wasn't real infra. It was a database exposed publicly to the web, and a tool that Eva and friends made called Firepwn could scrape these sites, find these endpoints, and just absolutely demolish them. Again, when all of the data is exposed, it's just about finding the right data. This hack was just going through all of the data they could access, finding an organization with ID 0, getting enough data to access, realizing this user's role was super admin, using their ID when hitting other things, realizing it's not even verified because they're not getting the ID from anything other than the actual value you're passing, and now they have access to all of the admin data. Kind of insane. Very common when you don't know how to build servers. Also, the cat chasing the mouse is adorable. Thank you, Eva, for making such a nice little site. So the simple core takeaways here: write your data code. If it's accessing data in your database, the code for it should be written by you on a server. Don't use Firebase. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And stop living in your bubble. If you're a mobile dev, stop only focusing on mobile. Go build something using web technologies. Build a real server and figure out how they interact. If you're a web dev and you're living entirely in the JavaScript ecosystem, go build it backend in Go. Go build a mobile app using Swift and Swift UI. Do something outside of your bubble so you can understand the other sides of the spectrum. Otherwise, you are just as victim to these things as anyone else is, because a lot of these companies are selling the promise of keeping you from doing the thing you don't want to do. Firebase isn't selling infra. They're selling the promise that you don't have to think about infra. And if you're not thinking about your infra, you're one step away from making the same mistakes that T made, that half of the fucking fast food companies in the US made, and so many more. You can make these mistakes on other places too, but Firebase seems a weird honeypot for grabbing this type of person and this way of thinking. Please stop doing this. Just define real endpoints. It's not that hard to do. Let me know what you guys think. Was I too hard on Firebase or was I being reasonable here? I know I was too hard on mobile devs, but trust me, I'm not actually being too hard on them. They need to hear this. Let me know what y'all think. And until next time, peace nerds.